Hello, and welcome to episode 8 of Elves, Rings, and Nerdy Things. I am your co-host, Sam, here with my other co-host, Sean. Sean, how you doing?
I'm doing great. Excited to talk about the season finale of Rings of Power Season 1.
Likewise, I'm glad that we are here to do so. Before we jump into it, a quick plug for our Facebook page, Elves, Rings, and Nerdy Things. Please go on there, give us a like, sign up to get our updates regarding the show and the future of Elves, Rings, and Nerdy Things. If you would like to reach out to us via email, elvesringsnerdythings@gmail.com. Please subscribe, rate, and review this podcast. Share it with your friends. Thank you to all those who are listening in. And finally, spoiler disclaimer for the books and the movies and the show. All Lord of the Rings content is up for discussion here.
Like Sam said, if you have anybody who's interested in all things fantasy, from Lord of the Rings to The Witcher to even some sci-fi things, send the podcast their way. We could use more listeners, expand our outreach. Whatever you can do to help us out we'd just be really thankful.
So thankful. 'Tis the season of giving thanks. We would like to thank all of you for listening. Let's jump into episode 8. Sean, would you want to kick us off with the recap?
Yeah, we're going to start with the Harfoots. We start with Meteor Man, who has been kind of pointed in the right direction by the Harfoots in the last episode. He makes it all the way to the Greenwood, which is another name for, you might be more familiar with the name Mirkwood. Before all of the evil stuff happened, it was called Greenwood the Great. He chases something that turns out to be that demon cultist shape-shifting to look like Nori. They call him Sauron and kneel before him. They say the more his powers awaken, the more he can use his powers, the more his confusion will disappear as to who he is. They reveal the constellation he's been looking for is in Rune, which is a region to the far east. They tell him how powerful he will become, and he starts to uncontrollably use his powers. To save themselves, they knock him out and say in time he'll learn to control his powers. The Harfoots show up as Meteor Man is being tied up. Sadok and Nori try to cut him down, but it turns out to be the shapeshifter in disguise. Sadok takes a knife to the stomach. Meteor Man awakens to fight the cultists. The shapeshifter starts to burn down the forest. Nori goes up to the Meteor Man and says, "We need your help," and gives the Meteor Man the shapeshifter's staff. He then puts out all the flames. They call him the Other and the Istar and proclaim that he is not Sauron. He sends them back to the shadow, and their true form is revealed to be ghostly like the Nazgul. Sadok passes away from his knife wound with everybody while he watches the sunrise for one last time. Meteor Man explains that Istar means wizard in her tongue, in Nori's tongue. Harfoots move on from the glade, while Poppy is named the new trail finder after Sadok's death. Nori is given a backpack to go with the Meteor Man, says goodbye to the Harfoots. Meteor Man is clearly Gandalf. There's lines from the Fellowship that he repeats, like you need to follow your nose if you don't know which way to go. And that is an end and a wrap up of the Harfoot storyline. Now, Sam, what happened with Galadriel and the elves?
All right. Switching over to that plot line, we open with Elrond and Celebrimbor discussing the imminent arrival of Gil-galad. They are in the forge in Eregion. They also discuss their situation, meaning they do not have the mithril that they needed. Before Gil-galad arrives, Galadriel and Halbrand arrive on horseback. She sends him to the healers. Following that, Elrond and Galadriel catch up. She asks for his trust. Halbrand, who's recovering from his treatment, meets Celebrimbor, and they discuss the situation of not having enough mithril. Halbrand gives Celebrimbor some ideas about stretching the mithril to meet their needs. Gil-galad arrives, and the 4 elven leaders, Gil-galad, Elrond, Galadriel, and Celebrimbor, discuss the situation. Gil-galad shuts down their plans and orders Celebrimbor to return his people to Lindon. Celebrimbor, in protest and also in describing his plan uses some very specific phrases that trigger Galadriel's suspicions. After the meeting breaks up, she asks him if Halbrand said those words, and Celebrimbor demurs. Elrond confronts Gil-galad, who relents and grants them a few more weeks. Work begins in the forge with Halbrand assisting. Galadriel asks an archivist for any research about the royalty and the royal lines of the Southlands. There's an explosion in the forge, after which Halbrand suggests using less pressure in the forging process. Galadriel receives and alone reviews the genealogy research conducted by the archivist. Halbrand then joins her, and she confronts him, asking him who he really is. He replies, in addition to saying some other things, that he has been known by many names, implying that he is Sauron. They have a brief physical confrontation, during which Halbrand/Sauron triggers a vision in which Galadriel is thrust back to Valinor and has a conversation with her brother Finrod. That vision switches to the raft where Galadriel first met Halbrand. Over the course of their conversation, he asks her to join him in ruling Middle-earth. She declines. She then wakes up as Elrond pulls her out of the river. Soaking wet, she returns to the forge, declares that Halbrand has left and they should never treat with him again. She then insists that instead of making 1 or 2 rings, that they make 3 rings to balance the power that they are harnessing. Celebrimbor asks her for the dagger, her brother's dagger, as they need pure gold and silver from Valinor. The dagger is melted down. It's added, or mithril is added to the melted down gold and silver. And then 3 rings are crafted using those metals and some jewels that Celebrimbor had. During the crafting period, Elrond returns to the river and finds the genealogy scroll, but we do not see him use that to have a conversation with Galadriel. And this plot line ends with the 3 elven rings of power having been created, and they look great.
In the last storyline, which is a pretty short one because there wasn't very much of the Númenóreans in this episode, the locked away king, Queen Muriel's father, is on his deathbed. Craftspeople are getting time to draw his image for his eventual enormous statue when he dies. Isildur's sister, Eärien, is in the room with him when he confuses her for Queen Muriel. The king unlocks the stairway to the Palantir in the tower for her, saying that there is still time to save Númenor. He reveals looking into the Palantir for too long made him go insane, not being able to separate what is from what was and what will be. Eärien goes up and sees the Palantir. Then we cut to Queen Muriel and part of the Númenórean army on their way back. Elendil talks about saving Galadriel and that he did so because his name doesn't just mean one who loves the stars, it also means elf friend. Muriel says the way of the faithful means committing to pay the price, trusting in the end that the cost is worth it. Elendil says they must make sure the end is worth the price and keep serving. They return to Númenor with black flags flying, signifying the death of the king. Now, that was by far the shortest of the storylines. The Harfoots had the most action in this episode, but the most, like the juiciest content was definitely Galadriel and the elves and Eregion.
I would agree with that. Sean, what did you think about this episode overall?
So this is where I think that we're fair. And we're not the Kool-Aid drinking fans, so we're not going to just say every episode was great. I think we agree pretty much that episodes 1 through 4 were pretty good. We were pretty optimistic with those overall. Episode 5 was a stinker. 6 was okay. 7 was a stinker. And we said last week that 8 really needed to blow us out of the water, or at least be a good episode to kind of get people excited to have to wait a year and a half, 2 years for the next season. And I really think that episode 8 kind of left us off on a really high note. I really enjoyed the episode from start to finish. I enjoy that we're getting past the mystery box stuff that we've talked about the last couple episodes, of the constant dragging us on who's Sauron, who's the Meteor Man. Like, we're starting to we know who Sauron is, and we're getting pretty clear hints about who the Meteor Man is. So yeah, I think overall pretty good episode. How did you walk away from this one?
Yeah, I like this one. I agree with your kind of summary of the episodes prior to this. I would say 5 and 7 were the low points. I think a lot of the seeds for those low points were sowed earlier in the show, even though those specific episodes may have reached a higher point. The thing about this episode is that all of the things that I object to and I dislike, the lore about the Mithril, the origin of Mithril, and the significance of Mithril, I don't like that. The issues with Galadriel and the relationship with Halbrand, I don't like that. A lot of the other kind of more logistics of military and travel and things like that, I still have those bones to pick. But this episode did a really good job of allowing me to actually suspend disbelief. And I found myself immersed in what was happening on screen. It didn't beg a ton of questions. To be fair, those questions have already been begged. And I really liked it. I liked the stranger stuff. I agree with you that the juiciest part of this episode was all the stuff happening in Eregion. We didn't get a lot of Numenor. We got none of the Southlands, which I was actually okay with. Those the Southlands especially, kind of, we left their story in the prior episodes. I'm sure we'll pick up with them, next season and the seasons to follow. But I really like this. And the biggest thing for me is what you've talked about since we first started reviewing the show, is that suspension of disbelief. It has been so hard to achieve. But this episode, they did it. And they did it despite all of the lore breaking, questionable characterization. And then even in this episode, there are a few clunky moments that we can talk about. But I thought this was a really strong way to end the season. I probably would have watched anyway, just because at this point we've kind of committed to it. And I still really like the Tolkien universe and the Legendarium, and I was going to consume it. But now I'm actually looking forward to seeing where things pick up.
Me too. And for the most part, we didn't have any of the dwarves in this episode either. So again, I think it was the last episode, they left off the dwarf storyline at a good point. You have Disa and Prince Durin kind of plotting to take over, or will run the show one day. So that's a good place to kind of end that. You don't have to do any more this season. Like you said, the Southlands, they're going to seek refuge somewhere else. Don't need any more of that. But we also got some, and it wasn't just like Galadriel and Halbrand showing up in Eregion. I was complaining the last episode when Halbrand was mortally wounded, the wound festered overnight, and then Galadriel's response is, "Oh, he needs elvish medicine. Let's get on horseback and go to the elves." So when you look at a map, that's basically the entire journey from the Shire to Mordor for Frodo. Like the entire 3 series of Lord of the Rings, that's the distance Galadriel and Halbrand go on horseback while he's on death's door.
Yeah.
And she says it took them 6 days.
Yeah.
Of constant travel by horseback. Now, when we find out that Halbrand is really Sauron, that's when I go, okay, that makes sense that he can survive 6 days with such a mortal wound, because he's probably just putting on a show that he's hurt. So things like that made sense. I liked that she actually told us how many days it took to travel, the 6 days, and not just like, oh, we got there the next day, or even up to us to think.
I would say even if those 6 days are a little extreme, given what we know about people crossing the distances in Middle Earth, like I think the ride from where the Rohirrim camp beneath the Mountain of the Dead Men to Minas Tirith, it takes 3 days. I can't recall. I think it's 3 days.
Yeah, from Dunharrow.
Yeah, from Dunharrow to Minas Tirith. So and they like cut through the forest, and
they're pretty much, they're in like the Gaps of Rohan, just south of Gaps of Rohan when they meet at Dunharrow, right?
I think they're actually a little bit closer to Gondor. I think
Gondor?
Yeah, so I think they had to like backtrack even further east past Edoras to get to Rohan, and then to get to Dunharrow rather, and then it's a 3-day ride, which we hear is like a hard, fast ride overnight. Which it makes sense that Galadriel and Halbrand would be riding really quickly. But the thing, I caught the 6 days as well. My immediate reaction was, I don't know, and then very quickly I moved past it because the episode, things were happening, and I think that has been a criticism, that not a lot happens in the series. And there's, if you want to pick some bones with the Harfoot plot line, I think this is one of the big ones. What actually happened with the Harfoots? But the scenes between Galadriel and Elrond and Celebrimbor and Gil-galad and all of that was so intriguing that I didn't care. They did a good job with this episode. This is my immediate takeaway. I think I was like walking the dog later the day, kind of mulling over my thoughts. And if this was a generic fantasy, I would have probably no problems with this show. All of my problems have to do with the fact that it's set in a universe about which I know a lot, and about which I know that they're breaking the lore. There are some things that don't make sense in universe, regardless of where it would be. But this would be a very good episode of television
if it wasn't Tolkien.
If it wasn't Tolkien, and even if they're, we have to say that it is, it's still a good episode.
Yeah, the series as a whole, if it wasn't Tolkien, it'd be a good series. At least that's my opinion, and you have to listen to it because you're listening to our podcast.
Unless you do the 15-second skip.
Unless you skip me. Your next point, Sam, not a lot of Numenor, and you were okay with that. Why?
Yeah, I think Numenor is going to play a much bigger role in the next season, and things ended at a very good point. The king is dead. Muriel is blind. We know that there's some sort of succession crisis coming, some sort of struggle for power. We've confirmed Elendil confirmed for faithful. So we see kind of all the pieces are in place for a very good season 2, at least starting off point. We'll see what they do with it. I didn't need to spend any more time in Numenor. You got me the main points. I didn't need to have any of the Kemen, Aryan romance. They didn't need to show them eating oysters together or anything like that. We had one scene with Pharazôn, and that was effective. It kind of set up the idea of immortality, which we know is going to be a major motivation for him. And we see Queen Muriel at her. We see her at a very vulnerable place, and we can kind of see where things are going. We didn't need any more than that. They did a really good job getting a lot in place with very little screen time.
The meat of what was happening in this episode was in Eregion, and then a handful of stuff in the Southlands, or with the Harfoots as well in the Greenwood. So I didn't need anything else from the island of Numenor. I was happy what they gave us with Elendil. The last thing that we had, having him seem to be so against going to Mordor at the end of episode 7 with his soap opera scene of him crying.
Yeah.
I wanted to see how they were going to turn that to make it be like, okay, well, how is he then going to lead the Numenorians back and then found Gondor? Where is that development? Because if you leave off season 1 with him basically regretting his actions of going there, that would have left me a little bothered. But I really enjoyed the fact that they reiterated the fact that he's part of the faithful. He says that his name means elf friend. He describes saving Galadriel not as the sea is always right, but I wanted to save her because she was an elf. So it just put a lot of things into better perspective. And I just said, I hated that original explanation of why he saved her. The sea is always right. That's so dumb.
Yeah.
Why didn't they just from the get-go have him be more of the faithful? That's such a better storyline than, well, a piece of driftwood washed up, so I took it home because the sea's always right. Like, it's so dumb.
This is something that we can get into in this kind of season recap. I think it's indicative of some of the problems that we've had with the series. And you can point to, little things such as Elendil's motivation. You can point to bigger things like the identity of Sauron. Why the mystery, right? The genre of fantasy, especially the genre of a high fantasy, which is what Lord of the Rings is. It's about heroes and villains. You know who the heroes are, you know who the villains are, and it's all about the resolution of the conflict, it's usually about the overcoming of the villain by the hero. It is not a mystery surrounding identities or locations or little clues. That's an area where I think it contributed to a lot of this. What's happening? The plot is boring, kind of filling space with strange dialogue. When the series is at its best is when people are, making bold decisions that we view as right, that we view as good, and then following through with them. An action obviously stems out of that. I thought we could have just stopped hinting that Elendil was an elf friend. We could have just known that. And the conflict, his conflict might be between making sure that Numenor itself is not steered in the wrong direction now that the king is dead and Muriel is vulnerable, but maybe, and it's torn between that and then going back and finding his son.
Yeah. And I guess with the mystery of who Sauron is, to me, the problem is Sauron has been revealed as one of the characters who's been in this season. If Halbrand would have ended up being like a Lord of the Southlands and they didn't introduce Sauron until season 2, then I would have no problem with us speculating and just being wrong. Part of the problem is with Sauron being Halbrand, now that it's revealed, it seems obvious. And I guess no one ever really thought that Meteor Man or the Stranger was going to be Sauron, right? Like that was like too obvious to be Sauron. So I don't know. I think the mystery. Well, go ahead.
Well, I would say a lot of this stuff. I think there's a lot here to unpack, and it seems like season recap stuff because of how central this mystery was to the show, to the season, and also because it's part of what I think we would identify as the shortcoming in what it does to Galadriel's character. Right? This means she was palling around with the most powerful entity on Middle Earth at this point. I think that's probably fair to say. We don't really get a sense that she had any suspicions. There was nothing that she reacted to until Celebrimbor said the little phrase about a key turning a dam and the power over the unseen world and or the tapping into the unseen world and a power over flesh. Nothing else. Yeah. Maybe we're supposed to go back and kind of interpret some of the things that he says, but we always see her. I mean, we as the audience can point to those things about, the fight scene here and the pickpocketing and the forge interest and stuff like that. But Galadriel, who's supposed to be wise, never picked up on it. And now, at the end, she has this big moment. But that actually ties into one of the notes that you wrote in your reaction to the show, which is the scenes basically in Galadriel's head. So what did you think about these scenes?
Yeah, I thought it was a good representation of Sauron's powers, going into her head and making her see things, like having her feel like she's back in Valinor with Finrod, back on the life raft or wreckage. I thought the visualization was really cool. And then the actor himself, I think his name's Charlie Vickers, who plays Halbrand / Sauron, did really good, especially in the scene on the wreckage where he's trying to tempt Galadriel into joining him, basically. And that temptation mixed with lies and just the facade of trying to be welcoming. And then when she rejects him, that twist in his acting was phenomenal. I really enjoyed it. And then there was that scene where he's talking to her and they look down into the water and she sees the reflections. And then it's her reflection standing next to Sauron as the Dark Lord. Overall, I mean, just great cinematography, great acting. There was one part, the callback to the lines from Jackson's trilogy and The Hobbit. There's a couple times where the lines are said and I go, okay, I like it. And then there's times where they do it and I just hate it. And we've talked about callbacks to the Battle of Helm's Deep, Council of Elrond with the hobbits. Oh, I'm going with you. You're not going alone. All that stuff. And there were 2 times in this episode where they did callback lines, and I actually really liked it. The first one was Sauron saying, "You could be my queen. You'd be strong as the foundations of the earth." Basically, that callback to Galadriel when she's tempted with the ring and Frodo in Lothlorien. And I've seen a lot of commentary that people hated that, but I actually really like it to have Galadriel have already experienced this temptation with Sauron. And then when Frodo offers her the ring, all of that comes flooding back.
Yeah.
And why not have her repeat what Sauron promised her or says she could have? And the other, before I let you come in, the other line that kind of worked for me, that's a callback, to the trilogy is this is how I am almost positive Meteor Man is Gandalf. There's that line where he says, "When you don't know which way to go, follow your nose." I mean, that's verbatim from the Mines of Moria.
Yeah, I picked up. I was following both of those references back. I did not like the one with Gandalf or the Meteor Man.
Follow your nose.
I did not like that at all. It was just far too obvious. It was also from a like again from a physics question, like what is he smelling exactly? Right? Like
I guess
in
the
Moria,
air.
it was a confined space. You know, there was reason to believe that certain air smelled worse than other air because these were separate chambers. But he's just kind of sitting there at the top of the hill. The wind is blowing. Maybe those his like, you know, he's got the nose of a dog because he is now established to be a very powerful being. We'll set that aside. I've got some other thoughts about the Harfoots in this episode in particular. I agree with you that using lines of dialogue that Galadriel has later in the books or in the Peter Jackson movies works because it is the same context. I think there's even something, I saw this in the episode where she meets Halbrand for the first time on the raft, and there's a comment, and I can't remember what the specific line of dialogue is, like strange tides are these or something like that, which is something that she says again or for the first time in the Fellowship. And again, it makes sense. And it was actually one of those things that people pointed to as evidence that Halbrand was Sauron, which, you know, we'll talk about it next episode. I still have problems with that for what it implies, but in the moment, the dialogue being borrowed from the Fellowship in her scenes, I thought was effective. I agree with you that the scenes in her head were really good. I thought even the actor who played Finrod, he had two different portrayals. You know, same actor, although he was had a different expression on his face and probably shot it. They probably shot it differently. He had an air to him that you could see. This was Sauron playing Finrod, right? It was really, really well acted. I like the callback to the raft, and similarly with the kind of the offer, then temptation. You know, it's very, you know, I think we've mentioned very early on Tolkien and his faith and how Catholicism was something that he, you know, never made explicit references to, but it's kind of buried there within a lot of the themes and then behind Lord of the Rings. It's important to him personally. This is that, you know, scene. This is the temptation, right? Of thinking specifically kind of the fall of Lucifer, and, you know, better to rule in hell than serve in heaven. I think there's probably a lot of other comparisons that you could make there. That was an effective scene. They are seemingly making elves a bit more human and subject to that temptation. I would have benefited maybe from perhaps a little bit more reference to other elves in the past who had been tempted and not forced into evil. I think with Adar, you saw he was forced into evil, and he kind of was changed by a god, basically.
It's twisted, yeah,
twisted and tortured. This would have been very Tolkienian in a sense to set up another character in the backstory of the world that had a similar temptation. And they've already invented lore characters. You could invent another lore character that would kind of be a mirror, no pun intended, of Galadriel's decision at that point. And maybe she could choose differently. And that would be a sign of her strength. But overall, I agree with you. Those scenes were great. Yeah, it was a really dramatic way to do this reveal.
And one other thing I wanted to mention quick, another reason I think Meteor Man is Gandalf. There was a scene when he's being handed the staff by Nori, and when he grabs it, and this might be looking into it way too much, his fingernails are almost the exact same as Gandalf's when he holds the staff in, I believe it's Two Towers, when he's Gandalf the White. When he grabs the staff, there's a shot where they go close up on his fingernails. And when he grabs the staff in episode 8, it's almost the exact same. Now, I'm going to try to find a picture for you when we're off recording so I can prove this to you. And I'm hoping that another listener also caught that, but we'll see.
I'll take your word for it. I think maybe this is a good point to pivot to this plot line in particular. Before we talk about the Harfoots, though, you mentioned in the recap that he's Gandalf. You've presented your evidence. I think a lot of people out there would agree with you that he is Gandalf. The follow your nose line, a lot of the way that he was acting, kind of seemingly once he was bonked on the head and woke up and figured out. Well, there was also, I guess, the pep talk from Nori that kind of gave him whatever courage or inspiration he needed to become his true self. I don't really like him as Gandalf. We already have wizards in the Legendarium that we know relatively little about. It would have been very easy to do something new. I think my overall issue with this plot line is, what's the point? It took 8 episodes to get here. It could have happened in far fewer episodes. They are now moving further away from the action. I guess you could say, if those cultists, those beings, were correct about where Sauron needs to go, then in future seasons, perhaps Sauron, the character that we have previously called Halbrand, will go there and we'll get a confrontation. Although that would seem like something that would be relatively significant for Gandalf. And maybe we would have had reference to, seems like the type of thing where there's going to be additional lore deviations in the future that might not sit well with folks. But you don't need it to be Gandalf. You've got other characters, other wizards who went east and actually did a lot of good in the struggle against Sauron. Yeah, so
well, as far as we know, and that's why I'm okay with this being Gandalf, because it gives us a character that we know. He can still go to the east and meet the 2 blue wizards that went to the east. If they call him an Istar, that means that there's got to be other Istari out there. So I think in seasons 2 through 5, we do get other wizards, and we could actually see their downfall. Because, I mean, in the lore, Tolkien never says that the 2 blue wizards that go east die. They're just not really involved with anything else that happens in the story. In the video games, Shadow of War and Shadow of Mordor, they insinuate that the 2 blue wizards have been killed by lieutenants of Sauron.
Yeah. I mean, let me say this. I am open to what they do with the rune plotline, if that is indeed where we go, and we continue to follow the stranger / Gandalf and Nori there. It doesn't need to be Gandalf to still be cool, right? It doesn't need to be Gandalf in order to be significant in the second age, the end of the second age and the beginning of the third age at this period of time. But so going back to kind of the overall Harfoot plot line, it got far too much screen time for what it ultimately accomplished. They were annoying characters. I feel like if we could have cut that completely, we would have had more time to spend in the Southlands, which we really liked, to spend in Khazad-dûm and kind of flesh out some of those relationships, which we really, really liked. And then even to spend more time with Celebrimbor, who I thought Charles Edwards gave a great performance as Celebrimbor in this episode specifically. And in prior episodes, he's been limited to 1 or 2 lines. Mm-hmm. And really, you don't get a ton of his motivations. They could have done a better job setting up the fating that the elves are going through and set up the necessity of creating the rings and highlighted the urgency that they're supposedly moving with. And we just spent so much time with the Harfoots that it was, kind of really frustrating in retrospect.
Well, luckily, I don't think we get any more Harfoots now. I think we get Nori, but in season 2, they've already done their share of the story. So yeah, I think you might get in later seasons like a resurgence at some point of the Harfoots, but I think for the most part in the near future, I think the only Harfoot hobbit we're going to see is going to be Nori, which I think settles part of our problem.
I agree, and I think that you could have cut this entire plot line from season 1 rather. Season 2, you could pick up with this character, be he Gandalf or not, and Nori, and you could have just through dialogue discovered everything that got us to the point where they are in season 2. And you could have even made it a little bit more tragic, like, right, her entire group could have been wiped out by orcs or the eruption of Mount Doom. She's the only survivor. He is protecting her, taking her to find some other group of her people. They're doing that by, going through Rune where he has, maybe part of his quest. And you don't need to show all that tragedy on screen. You can allude to it. You still get great character moments between the two of them. Again, this is complete speculation about what Sam would do if Sam were creating season 1 and season 2 of the Rings of Power, but I'm not. So let's just cut it there and save it for future reactions.
Last commentary that I have, some negative things. I have a lot of good things to say about this episode, but there's 2 pieces of writing that I just didn't like at all. The first one, speaking of Harfoots, is the line as this Meteor Man Gandalf character is about to banish the demons, cultists. They basically say, oh, he's not Sauron, he's the other, the Istar. And then his response, instead of saying something cool, like he could have gotten up and said, if you don't know, Gandalf's real name as a Maiar is Olorin. He could have stood up and said, I am Olorin, and then banished them. And that would have been epic and cool and good fan service. But instead, he just stands up and goes, I'm good, and then banishes them. It was the most anticlimactic line, just terrible writing. How many times do we have to have that Nori telling him he's good?
Yep.
And he's at the point where he's starting to, he's having pretty fluid conversations after this.
He has that eloquent line either right before or right after he says, I'm good, where he says, return to the shadow from whence you came or something like that. Like all of a sudden he went from 3rd grade or, maybe a toddler level of English to, Oxford Don using whence and not dangling prepositions. It was such a strange juxtaposition. And then that line, I have to agree with you. Very few occasions in this episode where suspension of disbelief was challenged. That was one of them. Just go back and read your first draft again and say, I'm going to fix that.
Yeah. And luckily this was one where it immediately was fixed by the cool shots of him banishing them and them turning into those Nazgul looking creatures. I really enjoyed that. And it was able to fix the writing issue that I had. But the other writing point,
real quick.
Okay.
Because what you just said reminded me of something. And I think this is more evidence that this is Gandalf. When he's banishing them, their forms turn into that kind of shadow, skeleton, ghost, ethereal form. But then also they kind of disappear as moths, right? Did you see that? Like a big moth that shows up on one of their faces, and then they kind of float away or fly away. I thought, okay, that is more evidence that he's Gandalf. This could be a little bit of misdirection. He could be Radagast, maybe, but I think you're right.
He's Gandalf.
All right, you were going to say another area where the writing.
Just the only other writing thing that kind of took me out of it for a brief moment was when Galadriel awakens out of her dream that Sauron was in, and she questions Elrond and is like, "What's something only you would know?" And then he comes up with the answer, and she just gets up and runs away. She's not like, "Oh my gods, Sauron is here." We've basically let the fox into the henhouse. Let's find him and kill him. She just sweeps it under the rug because she's afraid of what everyone else is going to think of her for not knowing and becoming an ally of Sauron, basically. But that just seemed so far out of character for her to just be like, I'm going to spend the first 7 episodes doing whatever it takes to find this guy and kill him. And then I find out who he is, and then I'm just not going to tell anybody else. And I do think that Elrond knows, because there's that last episode, the last part of the episode where it shows him looking at the scroll, and then he walks up, and when he sees that the rings are made, he kind of shows the scroll to Galadriel, kind of insinuating that he read it and kind of put the pieces together, or at least that Halbrand isn't who he says he is. But there was that moment where I was just like, would Galadriel really do that? Has she all of a sudden become so self-centered about what the other elves are going to think of her? Because every other time, when it comes to what elves think of her, she just doesn't give a shit. I'm going to keep going through the north until I find Sauron. I'm going to jump off of the boat, going into Valinor so I can continue to try to find Sauron and kill him. And then, yeah, I don't know. It just seemed so strange for her to just now all of a sudden be like, elves might really think negatively of me. I
Yeah.
shouldn't tell them.
And this is maybe where, again, having a little bit more time with these elves, Elrond, Celebrimbor, Galadriel, even Gilgalad, you maybe it could have been a little bit more sensical when she says Halbrand. I think she said something like Halbrand isn't who he says he is, and we should never treat with him again, or something like that. Well, they're naturally going to say, how do you know that? Like, what do you mean he isn't who he says he is? So then she's lying to them if she doesn't tell the truth, right? And earlier in this episode, she asks Elrond to trust her again. And I think there's a callback to it. And I can't remember if it's in this scene at the end where she says we shouldn't treat with him again, or if it's earlier where she's talking about the forging, right?
I don't know if it's the forging, but when she jumps off of the boat because evil's not dead, and Gilgalad basically tricked Elrond into sending her off, because there's that whole scene where Gilgalad goes, well, she's not wrong, the evil is still out there. I think at that point Elrond looks at her and goes, I'm sorry, I didn't believe you, I'll trust you from now on, or something like that. And that's a callback to that, where she's saying, I need you to trust me now.
I think, okay,
I might need to, at least that's how I interpreted that.
Maybe I need to rewatch to understand the full context and how I got that impression. But so in addition to the I'm good, Galadriel not saying Halbrand was Sauron, and I think part of it is because he specifically in the vision said, what are they going to think of you when they learn that you allied with me, you supported me, you brought me here? He kind of sets it up. So to me, it's understandable that in that exact moment when she's in high stress, she is maybe more vulnerable to that suggestion, because we saw her kind of tempted already. I don't know how I feel exactly about her not immediately revealing to him or his identity. I will say that there were a few occasions where I don't know if the writers know what Morgoth and Sauron mean, because those are both terms that Sauron and Morgoth and their followers would not use. This is not the first time this has happened in the show, but Sauron means the abhorred or the abominable, and he would not, and his followers would not refer to him as such. He also has a Maiar name. It's do you know it? No, I think it's Myron.
I'll look it up while you keep talking.
I think it's Myron. And then he went by a bunch of other names, as he says. I don't think he or his followers would call him Sauron, it was weird when Waldreg said it. It was weird when the three cultists said it. And additionally, I think Adar says Morgoth, and Sauron or Halbrand says Morgoth. Morgoth, again, was an elven or elvish term for the great enemy or something like that. Morgoth's actual name was Melkor, and there probably would have been other terms that his followers used to refer to him. So I think there were little issues where it's an easy fix. It might be something where for the ease of the audience, they just use the terms that everybody knows. But I don't think that many people know Morgoth.
At least for a fix for that, when Sauron refers to himself, at least he doesn't call himself Sauron.
Correct.
He says, I go by many names. And those names include
here we go.
Anatar, Artano, Aulendil, Myron, Gorthaur, and Zigur. He's also identified as the necromancer.
Then that's right. Where the first hint in this episode that they gave, which I liked when it happened, because it happened so soon after the cultists identified the stranger as Sauron, is when he's talking to Celebrimbor. They first meet. Celebrimbor gives him he picks up the mithril and he says, what's this? And they start talking about it. Celebrimbor says it's not enough. And then he brings up the idea of adding other metals to stretch. Mm-hmm. And Celebrimbor says, thanks for the idea. And Halbrand says, call it a gift.
Yeah.
And it's like, and that's a direct reference to Anatar, the Lord of Gifts, that was the guise that Sauron took when he actually came to the elves and taught Celebrimbor the art of ringcraft. So that was another little
good writing, an example of good writing.
Good writing, kind of a lore cut that's not not offensive to book readers. it was, I thought, also very effective at helping the audience come to the conclusion that they had already come to. It was helping the audience reach a conclusion that many people had already reached, especially anybody who was engaging with the reviews and the spoilers. And now that we can kind of talk about that, there were spoilers, I think, like a leak early on that Halbrand was Sauron. I thought that may have been a little bit of misdirection, kind of a double reverse in a certain extent. We can get into more detail about this whole, what the additional implications, and when you really stop and think about it, what it does mean for the characters that we know. But
and I will say, now knowing that Halbrand is Sauron, when because Carly, my wife is much busier than I am. So when I go back, the last couple of episodes, I kind of just watched so I could do these recordings with Sam. And now I'm going back and rewatching so I can catch up with Carly so she can finish out the season. We just watched episode 6 together. But I knew Sauron was Halbrand. Rewatched episode 6, and it gives you a completely different take on the episode when you rewatch it, knowing it now. So I don't know. I think I'm really interested to rewatch the entire season now, knowing all that I know, and I want to see what my opinion is after I rewatch. And this is all stuff that can be said next week in our season review. So look out for that, everybody. After this episode, our next one is going to be a season recap. It'll be exciting. We'll get into super depth on the things we liked and didn't like. And we're going to come up with a list, I think, of things that we hope the showrunners and writers will fix in the upcoming seasons.
Could be a lot of lists in this recap episode. And if that's good, then maybe we'll do just a straight 60 minutes of talking about the Harfoots. So I think there's a lot there.
Well, that's it for our recap for episode 8. Our next portion that we're going to cover is Not Nerdy Enough. Now, last week I quizzed Sam. He did pretty well, 8 out of 10, right, Sam?
I think so.
Yeah, about there. This week, Sam's going to quiz me to see if I'm nerdy enough to host a podcast. Next week, we have a little something special. Sam and I won't be quizzing each other. We will be making a quiz over the entire season 1 for all of you listeners to follow along to see how well you do. Thank you to Aaliyah and Angel for this suggestion. So if you think you are nerdy enough to host a podcast about Rings of Power, pay attention next week, see how well you do. We're excited to ask you questions. Now, Sam, have at it. I'm ready.
All right. 10 questions here for you, covering the span of the Legendarium and the movies and the TV show. What type of creature was Ancalagon the Black?
Oh, he was a dragon.
Correct.
Largest of dragons. Not the father of dragons, but the largest of dragons.
That is correct. A couple times this episode, we've used the phrase or the word Maya. Elrond is descended from what Maya who wed Thingol, king of Doriath?
Was this Maya's name Melian?
That is correct.
My gamer tag for Xbox is a Thingol reference, King Greymantle.
Nice.
If you're a listener, if you want to be my friend on Xbox, there you go.
There you go. Go give Sean a mushroom stamp. In the book, The Fellowship of the Ring, to what town on the border of the Shire does Frodo move before beginning his flight to Bree and eventually Rivendell?
I think it's a town that's a little bit farther away. Is it Buckland?
Incorrect.
Is it
what is it? Crick Hollow.
It's farther than Buckland.
I think so. Sam rescues Frodo from the tower in what pass through the mountains of shadow, the name of which translates to Spider's Cleft?
Can you repeat the question?
Yes, the grammar is a little hard to follow. Sam rescues Frodo from the tower in what pass through the mountains of shadow, the name of which translates to Spider's Cleft?
I don't remember the name of the pass, but the tower is Cirith Ungol.
That is the name of the pass.
Oh, it's the pass too? Okay.
Yes. Spider's Cleft, which in writing this question, I finally noticed that Kirith Ungol. Kirith is cleft or pass. Ungol is spider, and that of course gives us Ungoliant.
Ungoliant, yeah.
I
Ooh, wow,
just realized
yeah.
that. It's like somebody made up this language from scratch. Name any one of the 3 trolls that capture Bilbo and the dwarves early in the quest for Erebor.
Bert.
Bert is correct.
I don't know the other 2, but I know Bert.
You only needed one. You got Bert, Tom, and Bill, or William.
Talk about racist tropes. Don't
Oh
they
yeah,
all have like terrible Cockney accents?
The Cockney accents, yeah. Question 6. While conversing with Smaug, Bilbo gives a series of made-up names and epithets. Which name causes Smaug to conclude that Bilbo is from Lake Town, prompting him to attack the settlement?
Barrel Rider?
Correct. Barrel Rider. Question 7. In episode 8 of The Rings of Power, when confronted by Galadriel and asked for his name, Halbrand/Sauron replies that he has been, quote, awake before the breaking of the first silence. To what does this refer?
Is it the Song of the Ainur?
Correct. I think the music of the Ainur is the title, or it's another way to translate this. And then the section in the Silmarillion that describes this is the Ainulindale.
And the look on her face when he says that was amazing. Just overall great scene from the episode.
Yeah. I mean, and that was also a really great way to announce who you are, right? I've been around since literally the beginning of time. Question 8. While diverting Elrond's questions about the whereabouts of Durin, Disa references the preparation of what dish that frankly sounds disgusting?
Something stew, right?
It is a stew.
I don't know, blood pudding stew.
that sounds pretty gross. She references mole tail stew.
Mole tail.
Yeah, which I thought when I heard it was like, okay, that's just sounds kind of gross, but I guess the writer's like, okay, they're dwarves, they live under the mountains. What are some subterranean animals that they could eat? I'm like, moles. Question number 9. Founded in 1987 by Richard Taylor and Tanya Roger, what is the visual effects company that worked on both Lord of the Rings and The Rings of Power?
Weta Workshops.
Weta Workshop is correct.
Which is a reference to a beetle, correct? That is endemic to New Zealand, I believe.
Oh, it could be. I think it might be a Maori name. Maybe the Maori name for that beetle. Okay, final question. Question 10 in our 8th installment. And you are not nerdy enough. What orc in the Return of the King movie is a reference to Harvey Weinstein?
Oh, Gothmog.
Correct.
Because who was it that said that? Was it Sean Astin in one of the
I think it was
behind the scenes things?
And I because Miramax was a studio that I think they were one of the producers at some point. And I think Weinstein was insisting on making it a 2 movie package instead of the trilogy. And I think he was like, if you don't make it 2 and try to make it 3, I'll, pull my funding or ruin you or something like that. And eventually, I think maybe after they brought in New Line to produce, that stopped being an issue. And I think it was the head of the New Line studio was like, no, this needs to be 3 movies. And then Harvey Weinstein is forever memorialized as Gothmog, the ugliest orc in that movie, and actually more attractive than Harvey Weinstein in real life.
True. No shade to Gothmog.
All right, Sean, you got 9 questions correct. I'm going to give you credit for Stu.
No, I don't deserve credit for Stu.
All right, fine. You got 8 questions correct.
Because I feel like what kind of food do dwarves eat? Stew is probably like the stereotypical answer. I should have. Mole tail was what I needed. I'm going to dock a point for that one.
You can dock your mole tail. It is funny that with in the dwarven plot line, there are like multiple references to food, because Disa says something about questioning a dwarf woman in her own house. That's asking for strong gravy, which is a funny phrase. And then they have the mole tail stew reference, and then of course we have the famous previously discussed
Give it to me
quail
raw.
sauce and raw meat. Okay, excellent
Well,
job. You are nerdy enough to continue hosting this podcast.
yeah,
To
thank
that
you.
end, do we want to reference? We have a poll out there for our next topic. I think right
Sure.
now, The Witcher is the winning topic. Although
Andor is a close second, the Star Wars series on Disney Plus.
So if you have a opinion on what we should cover next, please let us know. I think we are obviously planning on doing the recap episode, and I don't believe we're going to take much of a break before moving into the next topic. So let us know quick so that we can get all that in place.
Yes, and a dark horse. This is just putting it out there in case anybody does or is really dying for this. Vox Machina season 2 on Amazon Prime comes out in January. So if you would like us to cover new episodes of Vox Machina season 2 as they come out, Sam and I would really like to do season 1 first as a lead up to season 2. So I guess if there's like a unanimous consent for everybody that wants it, then we might try to pull the strings to get that going. But otherwise, it's Witcher, Andor, and then anything else you guys might want.
Next so let us know.
Yeah, next week, like I said, Not Nerdy Enough will be a quiz for the audience to see how well you do. Season recap next week. We'll go really in depth on the things we liked and didn't like. Sam, you have anything else you want to add?
I think that's it for me. I just maybe finally wrapping up with this was a good to great episode. And I'm very glad that we agree about that. I think, we can dive into the series as a whole in the next episode, but I just have to say I was relieved at how I felt coming out of this episode.
Okay, bye everybody.
Bye.